On a cold February morning in the year 1554, the Tower of London stood quiet beneath a pale and uncertain sky. Winter had not yet loosened its grip on the city, and a thin mist lingered above the stone walls and narrow courtyards. The air was still, heavy with the silence that comes before difficult events, when even ordinary sounds seem softened by anticipation. Within the tower, a young girl prepared to die. She was no more than 16 years old. Only months before, she had been proclaimed Queen of England. Now she waited in a small chamber of stone, dressed in black, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Those who saw her that morning would later remember her calmness, not the calmness of indifference, but something quieter and deeper, a kind of acceptance that seemed far older than her years. Her name was Lady Jane Grey. For 9 brief days the crown of England had rested upon her head, though she had never sought it, and had never believed it truly belonged to her. Power had come to her suddenly and against her will, carried on the ambitions of others and the fragile hopes of a kingdom divided by faith and loyalty. It had passed just as quickly, leaving her behind within the walls of the tower where she had once entered as a queen and remained as a prisoner. The morning moved slowly. A small fire burned in the chamber hearth, though it did little to warm the cold stone. Light filtered through the narrow window, faint and gray. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city was waking, merchants preparing their stalls, bells marking the hour, boats moving quietly along the Thames. Life continued, as it always did, even on a day such as this. Jane had spent the previous evening writing in a small prayer book that lay beside her. The pages held careful lines written in a steady hand, messages meant for those she would leave behind. Words of faith, of instruction, and of farewell. The book would accompany her to the scaffold later that morning, a final possession carried through the last moments of a life that had always been shaped more by study than by ceremony. Books had been her comfort since childhood. Long before she became a queen, before her name appeared in proclamations and council papers, Jane had been known as a scholar. She read Latin and Greek with unusual ease, and she studied the writings of ancient philosophers with a seriousness that surprised even her teachers. In quiet rooms far from the noise of courtly life, she had discovered a world of ideas more stable than the uncertain fortunes of noble families. It was said that she preferred the works of Plato to the entertainments of the hunt, and the calm discipline of learning to the restless pleasures of the royal court. Knowledge offered a kind of refuge, a place where ambition and rivalry seemed distant, and where order could be found in carefully written lines. Yet learning could not protect her from the circumstances of her birth. Jane had been born into a family whose position near the royal line brought both opportunity and danger. From an early age her life was guided by expectations she could not control, shaped by decisions made in rooms where she was seldom present. The choices that would eventually determine her fate belonged not to her but to those who saw in her name and lineage the possibility of power. Even now, on this final morning, the path that had brought her here might have seemed difficult to believe. Only 7 months earlier she had lived as a young noblewoman whose days were devoted to reading and study. Her future, though uncertain, had appeared quiet and orderly. No one could have guessed how swiftly events would unfold, or how completely her life would be transformed in the space of a single summer. The crown had come to her not as an honor but as a burden. When she first learned that she was to be made queen, she had resisted the idea with visible distress. The throne, she believed, belonged by right to another. But duty, persuasion, and pressure had combined in ways that left little room for refusal. Surrounded by those she trusted, guided by voices that spoke of responsibility and necessity, she accepted a role she had never desired. The decision would define the remainder of her life. Footsteps sounded occasionally in the passage outside her chamber, quiet and measured against the stone. Guards moved through their duties with the restraint expected on such a morning. Nothing in their manner suggested haste. The day had its appointed order, and each moment would unfold as it had been arranged. Soon she would be led across the courtyard to a small scaffold prepared within the tower walls. Not long before, she had entered this same place by water, traveling along the Thames in the ceremony that marked the approach of a new monarch. Then the tower had been a place of expectation, where kings and queens awaited coronation. Now it served its other purpose, older and more enduring, a place where the uncertain fortunes of power came to their final resolution. Jane rose at last and moved toward the window. From there she could see only a narrow portion of the courtyard below, framed by stone and shadow. The winter light revealed little detail. It was enough to remind her where she stood, within the fortress that had witnessed so many endings before her own. She had lived only a short time. For 9 days she had been Queen of England. Before that she had been a daughter, a student, and a young girl who preferred quiet rooms and open books. And now, on this still February morning, she was walking slowly toward the end of a story that had never truly belonged to her. Lady Jane Grey was born into a world where bloodlines carried weight far beyond the quiet walls of the household. From the beginning, her life was shaped not only by family expectations but by the distant presence of the English crown, a force that reached even into the nurseries of noble houses and quietly influenced the futures of children who had no voice in their own destinies. The exact date of Jane's birth was never recorded with certainty. Most historians place it in the year 1536 or early 1537, during the later years of the reign of King Henry VIII, when the royal court was still unsettled by the consequences of recent marriages and shifting alliances. England was a country in transition, and questions of succession were rarely far from the thoughts of those who lived close to the throne. Jane may have been born in London, where her parents often resided, or at Bradgate House in Leicestershire, the family's country estate surrounded by quiet fields and wooded hills. Bradgate would later become closely associated with her childhood, a place remembered for its stillness and its distance from the restless life of court. In those early years, however, the location mattered less than the circumstances into which she had been born. Her father, Henry Grey, belonged to one of the oldest noble families in England. He was ambitious, intelligent, and deeply aware of the importance of rank. Though he held honorable titles and enjoyed royal favor, he believed his family destined for greater influence. Advancement at court required patience and careful alliances, and Henry Grey watched the shifting fortunes of noble houses with close attention. Jane's mother, Lady Frances Brandon, brought with her an even closer connection to the royal line. She was the daughter of Mary Tudor, the younger sister of King Henry VIII, and therefore the granddaughter of King Henry VII. Through her mother, Jane belonged to the extended family of the Tudor dynasty. The connection was a matter of pride, but it also carried a quiet sense of expectation, a reminder that the fortunes of the royal house might one day reach unexpectedly into their lives. In the years of Jane's infancy, the English succession remained uncertain. King Henry VIII had struggled throughout his reign to secure a male heir, and although Prince Edward had finally been born in 1537, the stability of the future could never be taken entirely for granted. Noble families with even distant royal blood were aware that circumstance could suddenly bring them into prominence. Jane herself was too young to understand such matters, yet they formed the background of her earliest years. Conversations about alliances and inheritance, titles and marriages, took place among the adults who shaped her world. Decisions affecting her future were discussed long before she could speak for herself. To later observers, it sometimes seemed that Jane's royal ancestry was less a privilege than a burden waiting quietly in the distance. Her parents had hoped for a son who might carry forward the ambitions of the Grey family. Instead, their first child was a daughter, delicate, serious, and thoughtful from an early age. Though daughters could also serve important purposes in the strategies of noble households, the arrival of a girl was not greeted with the same satisfaction that a male heir might have brought. Jane would eventually be followed by two younger sisters, Catherine and Mary. Together the three girls grew up within the disciplined structure of a noble household where behavior was carefully supervised and expectations were clearly defined. From an early age they were taught the manners and accomplishments appropriate to young ladies of high birth: needlework, music, languages, and religious instruction. Yet Jane's position as the eldest child gave her a particular significance. If advantageous opportunities arose, it would likely be Jane whose future was arranged first. Her parents' ambitions rested most heavily upon her, though she could not yet understand the meaning of those expectations. The world into which she had been born was one where lineage carried obligations as well as honors. Every connection to the royal family increased both prestige and risk. The same ancestry that brought distinction could also draw unwelcome attention, especially in times when the succession remained uncertain and loyalties were closely watched. England in the 1530s and 1540s was a country marked by religious change and political tension. The break with Rome had altered the structure of the Church, and the king's authority extended into matters that had once belonged to tradition. Noble families navigated these changes carefully, aware that misjudgment could bring lasting consequences. Within this larger world, Jane's early years passed quietly. She grew up in rooms where the rhythms of daily life followed familiar patterns: lessons in the morning, supervised recreation in the afternoon, prayers in the evening. Servants moved quietly through corridors, and tutors guided the education that would soon become the center of her life. The household provided order and stability, even if warmth and affection were not always present in equal measure. Visitors occasionally brought news from court, reports of ceremonies, marriages, and political developments that seemed distant from the stillness of Bradgate. These stories connected the family to a larger stage, reminding them that their fortunes remained linked to the changing direction of the kingdom. As Jane grew older, the meaning of those connections would become clearer. Her place within the Tudor family tree gave her a position in the line of succession, though it was a distant one. Ahead of her stood the king's children and other heirs whose claims were stronger and more immediate. No one could have predicted that circumstances would one day bring her name forward in earnest consideration. For the moment, she remained simply Lady Jane Grey, a child growing up in the shadow of possibilities she could not yet see. The crown existed only as a distant presence, part of the background of her life rather than its center. It was an idea discussed by others, a symbol of authority and continuity that seemed far removed from the quiet rooms where she spent her days. Yet the connection was always there, woven into the story of her family and into the expectations that surrounded her from birth. Long before she understood its meaning, the path toward the throne had already begun to take shape, slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly, within the circumstances of her earliest years. Long before she understood its meaning, the path toward the throne had already begun to take shape, slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly, within the circumstances of her earliest years. Those same years, which might have been remembered for warmth and security, were instead shaped by a discipline that many observers would later describe as unusually severe. Jane grew up in a household where expectations were clearly defined and rarely softened by affection. Order and obedience were valued above comfort, and the conduct of children was watched with careful attention. Her parents believed strongly in discipline and expected their eldest daughter to reflect the seriousness of her rank at all times. Henry Grey devoted much of his attention to matters of position and advancement. Like many noblemen of his time, he understood that influence at court depended upon careful alliances and steady ambition. Within the household his authority was firm, though his responsibilities often kept him occupied elsewhere. Lady Frances Brandon was known for a temperament that demanded strict obedience. As the granddaughter of a king, she had grown up conscious of rank and expected the same discipline from her children. To her, careful behavior was a necessary preparation for the responsibilities that awaited them in later life. Years afterward, Jane would describe her childhood in words that revealed the pressure she felt. Speaking to the scholar Roger Ascham during one of his visits, she explained that every action in the presence of her parents required careful attention. Whether she spoke or remained silent, sat or stood, ate or drank, appeared cheerful or serious, nothing was too small to escape notice. If her conduct failed to satisfy them, she said, she was sharply reproved and sometimes punished. The fear of displeasing her parents created a constant sense of watchfulness. She told Ascham that she felt greater comfort in the company of her tutors than she did among her own family, and that the hours spent in study brought her a sense of quiet relief. Books offered a kind of freedom that daily life did not. In reading she found order and certainty, a world governed by reason rather than by shifting expectations. Learning became a refuge where she could move without fear of correction. Visitors sometimes noticed the contrast between the formal discipline of the household and the quiet seriousness of its eldest daughter. Jane spoke softly and carried herself with a composure unusual for a child. She appeared thoughtful beyond her years, more inclined toward reflection than toward play. Within the structure of the household, the presence of attendants provided some stability. Among them was a nurse named Ellen, who cared for Jane during her early years and was remembered with particular warmth. In a home where affection was rarely expressed openly, such small kindnesses left a lasting impression. The routines of daily life continued with steady regularity. Lessons were conducted under careful supervision, and the accomplishments expected of a young noblewoman were practiced again and again until they could be performed with confidence. Needlework, reading, writing, and religious instruction filled the hours. Over time Jane learned to observe herself with the same strict attention that others directed toward her. She weighed her words carefully and considered the proper manner for every situation. These habits of self-control would remain with her throughout her life and would later be noticed even in moments of great uncertainty. Yet beneath this discipline there remained the curiosity of a thoughtful child. She listened closely to her tutors and showed an early interest in language and meaning. Where others might have grown restless, she often seemed content to remain quietly absorbed in study. Learning gradually became more than a refuge. It formed the center of her world, offering a sense of stability that few other things could provide, and it was through learning that her abilities would soon begin to attract wider attention. Learning gradually became more than a refuge. It formed the center of her world, offering a sense of stability that few other things could provide, and it was through learning that her abilities would soon begin to attract wider attention. From a very early age, Jane's education was conducted with unusual seriousness. While many children of noble families received instruction in languages and accomplishments, Jane's lessons quickly moved beyond the ordinary expectations for a girl of her rank. Tutors were chosen with care, and the hours of study became the most consistent part of her daily life. She learned Latin while still very young, reading simple texts at an age when many children were only beginning their letters. Greek followed not long afterward, opening the writings of ancient philosophers that would remain among her favorite companions. The discipline required for such study suited her temperament, and she approached each lesson with a patience that impressed those who taught her. Languages became a natural part of her world. In addition to Latin and Greek, she studied French and Italian, the languages of diplomacy and scholarship. Later she would begin the difficult study of Hebrew, guided by learned instructors who recognized her unusual ability. By her early teens she could read and write in several languages with confidence, an accomplishment that set her apart even among the educated circles of Tudor England. Those who knew her often remarked upon the seriousness with which she pursued her studies. Books were not merely exercises assigned by tutors but companions chosen willingly. While others sought recreation outdoors, Jane often preferred the quiet order of a study chamber, where the turning of pages and the steady voice of a teacher created a world removed from the pressures of household life. It was said that she preferred the writings of Plato to the entertainments of the hunt, and the calm discipline of reading to the diversions of music and dancing that occupied many young ladies of her age. Whether this preference came from natural inclination or from the habits formed in childhood is difficult to say, yet those who observed her agreed that learning brought her a contentment rarely seen elsewhere. Among her instructors were scholars influenced by the humanist traditions of the time, men who believed that education should shape both the mind and the character. Under their guidance Jane encountered not only language and grammar but ideas about morality, faith, and the nature of authority. The study of Scripture held an important place in her reading, and the religious convictions she formed during these years would remain strong throughout her life. Her teachers soon recognized that she possessed more than diligence. She showed a clarity of thought and a seriousness of purpose unusual even among gifted students. When questions were posed, she answered carefully, weighing her words before speaking. When difficulties arose, she persisted with steady determination. Visitors to the household sometimes asked to meet the young girl whose learning had begun to attract notice. They found not a display of brilliance but a quiet and thoughtful student who spoke modestly about her progress. Jane did not appear eager for praise, and she seemed most at ease when conversation turned toward books rather than toward the ceremonies and entertainments of court life. For Jane, study provided a sense of order that the wider world rarely offered. In the structure of language and the reasoning of philosophy she found patterns that could be understood and trusted. The clarity of written words stood in gentle contrast to the uncertainties that surrounded questions of rank and ambition. These years of education formed the foundation of the character that later observers would remember. The calm composure she displayed in difficult moments owed much to habits developed during long hours of reading and reflection. Through study she learned patience, discipline, and a quiet independence of mind. It was an education that prepared her not for the life she desired, but for the trials that would eventually come. As her reputation for learning grew, the quiet world of study began to draw her gradually closer to the larger circles of influence that surrounded the royal court. As her reputation for learning grew, the quiet world of study began to draw her gradually closer to the larger circles of influence that surrounded the royal court. Opportunities that might once have seemed distant now appeared within reach, shaped by connections that linked her family to the center of power in England. Around the year 1547, when Jane was about 9 years old, arrangements were made for her to leave the familiar routines of home and enter a new household connected closely with the royal family. Such placements were common among noble children, serving both educational and social purposes, and her parents understood that the experience might strengthen the family's position at court. Jane was sent to live in the household of Catherine Parr, the widow of King Henry VIII. After the king's death, Catherine had married Thomas Seymour, the brother of Queen Jane Seymour and uncle to the young King Edward VI. Their home became a gathering place for scholars and reform-minded courtiers, and it offered an atmosphere very different from the strict discipline Jane had known before. For the first time in her life, she encountered a household where learning and kindness existed side by side. Catherine Parr took a particular interest in Jane's education and encouraged the habits of study that had already begun to define her character. Catherine herself was a woman of learning, fluent in several languages and deeply interested in religious scholarship. Under her influence, Jane found not only intellectual guidance but a gentler form of supervision than she had previously known. Contemporaries later suggested that Jane remembered these years with a quiet gratitude. Catherine treated her with consideration and patience, encouraging her reading and engaging her in thoughtful conversation. The atmosphere of the household allowed Jane a degree of ease that had been rare in her earlier life. Within this circle she also came into closer contact with the young King Edward VI. Edward was only a few years younger than Jane, and like her he had been raised in an environment shaped by scholarship and religious reform. Though their meetings were formal and carefully supervised, they shared an interest in learning that created a sense of familiarity between them. Both children were educated according to the ideals of the Protestant humanist tradition, where study of classical languages and scripture formed the center of instruction. Books and discussion provided common ground, and it was easy for observers to imagine that their intellectual companionship might one day lead to a closer connection. Some within Jane's family quietly hoped that her presence in this household might place her within reach of greater possibilities. The young king's future was uncertain, and noble families watched the development of royal friendships with careful attention. No formal plans were made during these early years, yet the possibility of advancement was never entirely absent from the calculations of those who guided Jane's life. For Jane herself, however, the household offered something simpler and more immediate, a sense of belonging that had seldom been part of her childhood. The routines of study continued much as before, but without the constant tension that had marked her earlier years. Time passed in reading, discussion, and quiet instruction. The presence of Catherine Parr created an atmosphere of stability, and Jane seemed to flourish under its influence. For a brief period, her life followed a course that might have led toward quiet scholarship rather than political danger. Surrounded by books and guided by teachers who valued learning, she appeared to be moving steadily toward the kind of future she might have chosen for herself. That sense of security, however, would not last long. Events beyond her control were already beginning to reshape the household, and the stability she had found there would soon come to an unexpected end. That sense of security, however, would not last long. Events beyond her control were already beginning to reshape the household, and the stability she had found there would soon come to an unexpected end. In the late summer of 1548, the quiet order of Catherine Parr's household was suddenly broken by illness. Catherine, who had remarried Thomas Seymour after the death of King Henry VIII, was expecting a child, and in September she gave birth to a daughter. For a brief moment there was relief and quiet celebration, but within days complications set in, and Catherine grew dangerously weak. Jane, still only 11 years old, watched as the woman who had shown her so much kindness lay confined to her chamber. The household, once filled with conversation and study, grew hushed and uncertain. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, and the ordinary rhythms of daily life seemed to pause as concern deepened. On September 5, 1548, Catherine Parr died, leaving behind her infant daughter and a household suddenly without its guiding presence. For Jane, the loss was deeply felt. Catherine had been more than a guardian. She had represented a gentler world than the one Jane had known before. In her absence, that world seemed to vanish almost at once. At Catherine's funeral, Jane was chosen to serve as chief mourner, walking in solemn procession behind the coffin. Dressed in black, she followed the slow ceremony with a composure that observers later remembered. Though still a child, she carried herself with the gravity expected of her rank, moving quietly among mourners who understood that the death of Catherine Parr marked the end of something more than a single life. After the funeral, the future of Catherine's household became uncertain. Without her presence to hold it together, the sense of order that had once defined the home began to fade. Thomas Seymour, whose ambitions had long made him a controversial figure at court, soon attracted renewed suspicion from the king's advisers. Seymour's attempts to increase his influence, particularly his efforts to gain closer control over the young King Edward VI, led to accusations of dangerous ambition. Rumors spread quickly, and the atmosphere surrounding the household grew tense and watchful. Jane, who had come to associate this place with safety and learning, could not have understood the full meaning of these developments, yet she would have sensed the unease that settled over those around her. By early 1549 the situation had reached a crisis. Thomas Seymour was arrested and charged with treason. After a brief period of imprisonment, he was condemned and executed, another casualty of the political struggles that surrounded the Tudor court. With Catherine gone and Seymour dead, there was no longer a place for Jane in the household where she had spent some of her happiest years. Arrangements were made for her to return to her parents. The journey back marked a quiet turning point in her life. Whatever sense of protection she had known under Catherine's care was now behind her. The familiar routines of Bradgate awaited her once again, along with the expectations that had shaped her earliest years. Later accounts suggested that her return was not greeted with warmth. The ambitions that had once led her parents to place her near the royal household had come to nothing, and disappointment may have sharpened their treatment of her. Whether fairly or not, the failure of earlier hopes seemed to rest partly upon Jane herself. Once again she found herself living under the strict discipline that had defined her childhood. The contrast with the gentler household she had left behind must have been difficult to ignore. Where Catherine had encouraged her studies with patience, correction at home was more severe and less forgiving. Yet Jane returned to her books with the same quiet determination as before. Reading remained the one place where the tensions of daily life seemed to recede. The familiar structure of language and scripture provided a sense of continuity at a time when much else had changed. In study she found a steadiness that the wider world did not offer. The years that followed passed without great outward events, yet they carried her gradually toward a future that none of those around her could fully foresee. Political currents were shifting across England, and the young king whose friendship she had once known was growing older, and increasingly fragile in health. The years that followed passed without great outward events, yet they carried her gradually toward a future that none of those around her could fully foresee. Political currents were shifting across England, and the young king whose friendship she had once known was growing older, and increasingly fragile in health. By the early 1550s, real power in England rested less with the young King Edward VI than with the men who governed in his name. Among them, none rose higher than John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Careful, determined, and deeply experienced in the uncertainties of court politics, Dudley had secured a position at the center of government. Decisions passed through his hands, and his influence extended into nearly every corner of royal administration. He understood the kingdom not only as it was, but as it might soon become. King Edward's health had never been strong, and by 1553 there were growing signs that his life might be short. The possibility of the king's death forced a question that had long remained in the background: who would inherit the crown? By law, the succession pointed toward Edward's half-sister Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Her claim was clear and widely recognized. Yet Mary was a devoted Catholic, and many of Edward's Protestant advisers feared what her accession might mean. Years of religious reform had reshaped England, and those who supported the changes worried that a Catholic monarch might reverse them. For men whose fortunes were tied to the new order, the prospect carried both religious and personal danger. John Dudley watched these developments with particular concern. His authority depended upon the continuation of the government he had helped to shape, and he knew that Mary's accession might bring an abrupt end to his influence. A new queen would bring new advisers, and those who had risen under Edward might quickly find themselves displaced. If the succession could be altered, however, the future might take a different course. Attention gradually turned toward those members of the extended Tudor family whose religious sympathies aligned more closely with the Protestant cause. Among them was Lady Jane Grey, young, well-educated, and known for her strong Protestant convictions. Her royal ancestry gave her a distant but legitimate connection to the throne, and her character suggested a willingness to act according to conscience and duty. To Dudley, she appeared a suitable figure around whom a new settlement might be built. Jane herself remained far removed from these calculations. Her days continued to follow the familiar pattern of study and quiet routine, shaped more by books than by politics. If her name was mentioned in the private discussions of powerful men, she did not hear of it. Plans, however, were beginning to take form. Dudley strengthened his influence step by step, placing allies in positions of authority and building the support that would be necessary if the succession were to change. Such preparations moved quietly, concealed within the ordinary business of government. Only a few understood how much depended upon the uncertain health of the young king. Within Jane's own family, the possibility of advancement was not overlooked. Her father, Henry Grey, recognized the opportunities that might arise from closer ties with the Duke of Northumberland. Alliances between noble houses were often sealed through marriage, and the ambitions of families could be advanced through the futures of their children. The idea that Jane might play a role in larger events began to seem less distant than it once had. What had once been only a faint possibility now took on a more definite shape as Edward's illness deepened and the urgency of the succession question became impossible to ignore. Decisions were being made in council chambers and private conversations, setting into motion events that would soon reach into Jane's own life. She continued her studies, unaware that others had begun to imagine a future for her very different from the one she might have chosen. And it was in the midst of these quiet days that arrangements were set in motion that would bind her fate to the ambitions of the Duke of Northumberland and his family. And it was in the midst of these quiet days that arrangements were set in motion that would bind her fate to the ambitions of the Duke of Northumberland and his family. By the spring of 1553, the plans that had been forming in private began to take visible shape. Discussions between the families of Grey and Dudley grew more frequent, and the possibility of a marriage alliance moved steadily toward reality. Such unions were common among noble houses, strengthening political ties and securing mutual advantage. For those who arranged them, the match promised opportunity and influence at a time when the future of the kingdom seemed uncertain. For Jane, however, the proposal came not as an opportunity but as a disturbance to the quiet order of her life. She was told that she would marry Guildford Dudley, one of the Duke of Northumberland's younger sons. The decision had already been made before she was informed, and her consent was expected as a matter of obedience. Guildford was close to her in age, but the two scarcely knew one another, and the prospect of marriage to a near stranger filled her with unease. Later accounts suggest that Jane resisted the arrangement at first. She had little desire for courtly advancement, and even less for a marriage imposed upon her by political necessity. The life she valued most remained one of study and reflection, far removed from the ambitions that guided the decisions of others. Her parents, however, saw matters differently. To them, the marriage represented a step toward greater influence at court, and a strengthening of ties with the most powerful man in the kingdom. Such an opportunity could not easily be set aside. When Jane hesitated, pressure followed. Obedience was expected, and refusal was treated as defiance. Some later writers described this period in stark terms, suggesting that Jane endured harsh treatment until she agreed to the marriage. Whether every detail of these accounts can be confirmed or not, there is little doubt that the decision was not truly her own. The expectations of family and rank left little room for personal choice. In time she gave her consent, though without enthusiasm. The wedding took place on May 25, 1553, in a ceremony that formed part of a larger series of marriages linking the Dudley family with several important noble houses. The celebrations were elaborate, reflecting the importance of the alliances being created. Music, fine clothing, and formal ceremony filled the day, presenting a picture of prosperity and confidence to those in attendance. Jane passed through the rituals with the same quiet composure that had marked so many moments of her life. Observers saw a young bride fulfilling her role with dignity, though little in her manner suggested excitement or anticipation. The solemn habits formed in childhood remained evident even in the midst of celebration. Guildford Dudley himself was described as handsome and well-mannered, raised in a household accustomed to authority and display. Yet the marriage began without the sense of companionship that might have softened its arrangement. Husband and wife remained, in many ways strangers joined by the plans of others. Behind the ceremonies, larger events were unfolding with increasing urgency. King Edward's health had worsened, and those closest to him understood that his time might be short. The alliances created through marriage were part of wider preparations whose full meaning was known only to a few. What appeared outwardly as a season of celebration concealed a growing anxiety about the future. Jane entered married life without knowing how closely these events were connected to her own fate. The household into which she had married stood near the center of political power, and decisions made there would soon determine the course of her life. Only weeks after the wedding, the condition of the young king declined further, and the uncertainty that had long surrounded the succession began to give way to something more immediate and final. Time passed quietly within the household of Thomas Bullen, and Anne's education continued with careful consistency. Each day unfolded according to rhythms that balanced discipline with refinement. Morning hours were often devoted to reading and study, while afternoons allowed for music, needlework, or supervised walks through the gardens and surrounding fields. The structure of these days formed habits that would remain with and throughout her life, habits of observation, restraint, and thoughtful preparation. Books became familiar companions, and read not only devotional texts but also poetry and moral instruction, absorbing language that emphasized virtue, duty, and the proper conduct expected of a noble woman. These writings described an ordered world in which every individual had a place, and every action reflected upon the honor of one's family. Such lessons were intended to shape obedience and modesty, yet they also sharpened Anne's understanding of how reputation could be built, or destroyed, through the smallest gestures. Her father encouraged learning in ways that distinguished the Bullen household from many others. Thomas Bullen valued diplomacy and education, believing that knowledge strengthened a family's position at court. Conversations at table sometimes turned toward foreign affairs or royal negotiations, and Anne listened carefully even when the details exceeded her years. She learned early that power often moved quietly, expressed not in dramatic declarations but in carefully chosen words. Visitors occasionally arrived bearing news from court. Messengers and distant relations carried stories of alliances, marriages, and shifting favor. These accounts gave glimpses of a world beyond the boundaries of heaven, a world defined by proximity to the king and by the fragile balance of influence among powerful families. Among these stories, one figure appeared again and again, the young king, Henry VIII. Reports described him as energetic and accomplished, a ruler who excelled in sport and music, admired for his intelligence and charm. Though Anne heard his name only as part of distant conversation, the image of the king began to take shape in her imagination as a symbol of the glittering world that lay far beyond her daily routines. Yet court life remained abstract, something glimpsed through stories rather than experience. Anne's reality was quieter, shaped by tutors, family expectations, and the gradual unfolding of adolescence. She grew taller, more self-possessed, her manner increasingly composed. Those who knew her began to remark upon the quickness of her mind and the intensity of her attention. There was a seriousness in her that set her apart from many girls of her age. She listened before speaking and watched before acting, habits that gave her an air of maturity. At times she seemed older than her years, as if already aware that her future would demand more than ordinary accomplishments. The household itself functioned as a small world governed by hierarchy and custom. Servants moved through corridors with quiet efficiency, maintaining the routines that supported noble life. Meals appeared at regular hours, fires were tended, garments prepared. The stability of these patterns created a sense of permanence that felt reassuring, even as the larger world remained uncertain. Season followed season across the Kent countryside. Spring brought pale blossoms to the orchards, while summer filled the air with the warmth of long afternoons. Autumn introduced cool winds and early dusk, and winter drew the household inward around hearth fires and candlelight. Within these cycles Anne's childhood advanced almost unnoticed. It was during these years that the direction of her future began, quietly and almost invisibly, to take shape. For daughters of ambitious families, education was never an end in itself. Learning prepared them for roles that would strengthen alliances and extend influence. Marriage, service, and proximity to power formed the paths to which noblewomen advanced their families' fortunes. Thomas Bullen understood this well. His career depended upon royal favor and diplomatic success, and he recognized that his children might play roles within that wider strategy. Opportunities at court or abroad were not merely honors, they were investments in the family's position. Anne could not yet see these calculations clearly, but she sensed that expectations surrounded her. There was a feeling, difficult to define but impossible to ignore, that her life would not remain confined to the familiar landscapes of childhood. The lessons she absorbed during these years would accompany her far beyond Hever's walls. Discipline, language, and careful self-presentation formed a foundation that would later support her in unfamiliar surroundings. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the possibility emerged that Anne's education might continue beyond England, in courts where refinement and sophistication shaped the lives of noblewomen in ways England had only begun to imitate. The opportunity came quietly, as such opportunities often did in the world of Tudor diplomacy. It arrived not as a dramatic announcement, but as a decision discussed in measured tones among adults whose ambitions extended far beyond the walls of Hever. Thomas Bullen had secured a position that would allow his daughter to continue her education abroad, a rare privilege for an English girl and a sign of the family's growing influence. Anne was still young when preparations began for her departure. Travel across the Channel required careful planning, and the journey itself promised uncertainty as much as opportunity. Servants packed garments suitable for formal appearances, along with practical clothing for travel. Books and devotional items were selected with equal care, reminders of the discipline expected even far from home. The household moved with a subdued sense of importance. Though no one spoke openly of ambition, it was clear that Anne's departure marked a turning point. Childhood, with its familiar routines and sheltered rhythms, was beginning to recede. Anne herself could only partly understand the significance of what was unfolding. She knew she was leaving England for a place few around her had ever seen. The thought carried both excitement and unease, the promise of new experiences shadowed by the uncertainty of distance from everything familiar. The journey to the coast unfolded over several days, the countryside passing slowly beyond the carriage windows. Villages and fields gave way at last to the restless movement of the Channel ports, where ships creaked against their moorings and the air carried the sharp scent of salt and timber. Crossing the Channel was rarely comfortable. The waters could turn rough without warning, and even experienced travelers endured the passage with patience rather than pleasure, and remained close to her attendants as the vessel pitched against the waves, the English shoreline gradually fading into mist behind them. When land appeared again, it was a different world that greeted her. The court to which Anne was sent belonged to Margaret of Austria, Regent of the Netherlands and one of the most respected women in European politics. Margaret governed from Mechlin with a reputation for intelligence and careful authority, maintaining a household that combined political seriousness with cultural refinement. Within this environment, Anne entered service as a young attendant, joining a circle of girls whose education extended beyond the domestic accomplishments expected in England. Here she encountered languages spoken with ease, music performed with professional skill, and conversation shaped by the traditions of continental courts. Life in Margaret's household followed a discipline both strict and elegant. Days were ordered by lessons and appearances, yet there was a sophistication in these routines that distinguished them from the quieter patterns of Hever. The young attendants learned to move with composure through rooms where diplomacy and ceremony existed side by side. French and courtly manners became part of Anne's daily life. She listened carefully, absorbing unfamiliar rhythms of speech until the language began to settle naturally on her tongue. Communication required attention and memory, strengthening habits of concentration that had already begun to define her character. Margaret herself provided a powerful example of female authority. She governed territories, managed negotiations, and maintained influence among Europe's ruling families. Though Anne observed her from a respectful distance, the presence of such a woman could not fail to leave an impression. Here was a model of power exercised without noise, intelligence expressed through judgment rather than display. Margaret's court demonstrated that influence could be cultivated through patience and careful thought as much as through birth or title, and adapted gradually to this new environment. At first she spoke little, uncertain of unfamiliar customs, but observation soon gave way to confidence. Her attentiveness and quick understanding did not go unnoticed, and she earned a place among the attendants as one who learned swiftly and remembered well. The experience expanded her world in ways impossible to reverse. England, once the center of everything she knew, now seemed only one part of a much larger landscape shaped by alliances and rivalries across Europe. Yet even as Anne settled into Margaret's household, another opportunity was beginning to form, one that would draw her further into the courts of the continent, and deepen the education that had only just begun. The transition came as a natural continuation of the path already unfolding before Anne. Service in the household of Margaret of Austria had provided a careful introduction to continental life, but greater opportunities lay elsewhere. Through the same diplomatic networks that had brought her to the Netherlands, arrangements were made for Anne to join a new household, one whose influence and refinement were widely admired across Europe. France stood at the center of Renaissance culture in the early 16th century. Its court was known for elegance, learning, and artistic ambition, a place where manners carried as much weight as lineage and where subtlety often proved more valuable than display. For a young woman whose education had only begun to broaden, the prospect promised both challenge and transformation. Anne's journey south marked another quiet departure. By now travel had become less intimidating, though it still carried a sense of distance from everything familiar. Roads stretched through towns and countryside shaped by languages and customs different from those of England. With each passing mile, Anne moved further from the sheltered world of her childhood and deeper into the larger stage of European life. She arrived in France to enter the household of Mary Tudor, the young English princess who had been married to King Louis XII. Though Mary's marriage would be brief, her court provided an important first introduction to French royal life. English attendants surrounded the princess, preserving a sense of familiarity amid foreign surroundings, yet French influence was present in every ceremony and expectation. And watched closely, as she always did. Court life in France possessed a grace and confidence unlike anything she had previously known. Conversation flowed with an ease that reflected long tradition, while clothing and presentation conveyed a careful harmony between fashion and rank. Appearances mattered here not as ornament but as language, a means of communicating refinement, loyalty, and understanding. After the death of Louis XII, Mary Tudor returned to England, but remained in France. Her service continued in the household of Queen Claude, wife of the new king, Francis I. This transition placed Anne more fully within the heart of French court life, where the rhythms of ceremony and sociability unfolded on a grander scale. Queen Claude's household emphasized dignity and quiet order, yet it existed within the vibrant atmosphere created by Francis I's patronage of art and learning. Scholars, musicians, and poets moved through the wider court, contributing to an environment that celebrated intellectual curiosity as much as noble birth, and absorbed these influences steadily. French became the language in which she spoke most easily, and her manners reflected the polish expected among the Queen's attendants. She learned the art of conversation, not merely speaking, but listening with attentiveness and responding with measured wit. Dancing and music formed essential parts of courtly life. These were not simple entertainments but expressions of harmony and discipline, requiring control and awareness of others. And practiced diligently, developing the grace that observers would later remember as one of her most distinctive qualities. Fashion, too, became a form of education. French styles favored elegance over heaviness, movement over display, and learned how clothing could shape presence, how posture and gesture could transform appearance. These lessons would remain with her long after she left France. More important still were the habits of mind encouraged by the court's intellectual atmosphere. Discussions of literature and religion circulated quietly among those who valued new ideas. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry reached even the Queen's household, where educated attendants exchanged thoughts shaped by humanist learning, and listened more than she spoke. Yet these conversations deepened her understanding of a world in which belief and authority were beginning to shift in subtle but significant ways. Years passed almost unnoticed within this environment. The girl who had arrived from England grew into a young woman whose confidence rested not on rank alone but on education and experience. France became less a foreign land and more a second home, its language and customs woven into Anne's identity. And gradually, as time moved forward with its steady and quiet rhythm, the expectation began to form that Anne's place might once again change, that the education she had received abroad would soon find its purpose in England, where her family's ambitions continued to unfold. The years in France had refined Anne in ways both visible and subtle. Her posture, her speech, her understanding of courtly etiquette, all were shaped by observation and practice. Yet even as she gained confidence and poise, the shadow of England and her family's ambitions never left her. Letters from her father, updates from distant relatives, and news of political developments reminded her that her life abroad was not separate from the currents of power at home. By the time she returned to England, and was no longer a child but a young woman whose education and experience set her apart from most of her peers. The journey back was quiet, measured, and deliberate. She carried with her the sophistication of continental courts, the knowledge of languages, the habits of study, and the polished grace of someone accustomed to the demands of royalty and nobility. Yet returning to England did not mean the world she had known in France would continue. The court of Henry VIII was charged with intrigue, ambition, and the restless ambitions of those seeking favor. For Anne, who had once navigated the structured lessons of Margaret of Austria and the refined expectations of Queen Claude, the English court offered challenges of a different kind: political maneuvering, whispers of power, and the subtle threat that one misstep could bring ruin. Her father and family, ever mindful of opportunity, positioned Anne carefully. She was introduced to influential figures, observed the king's court, and became acquainted with the complex web of relationships that shaped Tudor politics. Every smile, every word, every gesture was a lesson in discretion and perception. And learned that appearance could be as potent as action, and that influence was often wielded quietly, through suggestion and presence rather than direct command. It was in these days, amidst ceremonies, formal dinners, and the constant rhythm of the court, that Anne's presence began to attract notice. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen the world beyond England, yet her intelligence and poise made her stand apart even in a place crowded with ambition. Courtiers noted her ability to converse fluently in several languages, her keen understanding of literature, and the calm assurance that seemed almost instinctive. At the same time, her return brought her into the orbit of men whose intentions were seldom innocent. Courtiers observed her not merely as a noblewoman but as a potential player in the continuing game of influence at the heart of the kingdom. Their ambitions, sometimes masked by courtesy, often sought to draw her into alliances that served their own ends. Anne, however, retained the habits that had been instilled during her years abroad: careful listening, measured speech, and the quiet study of human character. She could engage without revealing more than necessary, and her discretion soon became noted as much as her learning or beauty. It was during this period, in the halls and chambers of Henry VIII's court, that the early seeds of her later prominence were sown. The lessons learned abroad, of language, manners, and observation, now had their practical application. The world she had seen in France and the Netherlands became a framework through which she understood ambition, power, and the precariousness of favor. Even as her family sought to advance their position, and navigated these currents with the calm diligence that had guided her since childhood. Every interaction, every appearance, and every opportunity was shaped by both awareness and restraint. She understood that, in a court where loyalties shifted as quickly as alliances, prudence could be as valuable as charm, and patience might prove stronger than overt ambition. And so, Anne entered the court fully prepared for its challenges, carrying with her not only the lessons of continental refinement, but the subtle knowledge that influence, once gained, could be wielded with quiet power. Anne's presence at the English court did not go unnoticed. Nobles and courtiers whispered about the young woman whose education and poise set her apart, whose knowledge of languages and literature marked her as extraordinary, and whose beauty seemed inseparable from the intelligence behind it. Yet admiration was rarely simple. In a world defined by ambition, every gift invited both opportunity and scrutiny. Among those who observed her closely was King Henry VIII himself. Though the king was aging and burdened by illness, he remained ever attuned to the alliances and potential advantages that could be found in the marriages and associations of his courtiers. Anne's combination of lineage, education, and refinement made her a figure of interest, and her family's ambitions ensured that she would be presented in ways that highlighted her virtues. Court life required careful calculation. Every step, every smile, every gesture could be interpreted as a sign of loyalty, cleverness, or desire. And learned to move with discretion, to speak when necessary, and to measure her responses. Her years abroad had taught her that observation could be as valuable as speech, that silence could carry meaning equal to words. Meanwhile, Henry's court was a landscape of shifting alliances and careful maneuvering. Nobles vied for influence, advisers whispered in corners, and even a simple glance could be noted and reported. In this environment, Anne's ability to combine elegance with intelligence became her shield. She attracted attention not through brashness, but through quiet distinction, allowing others to reveal themselves while she remained composed. It was also a time when the Protestant Reformation had begun to shape loyalties and opinions across England. Anne, educated in the humanist tradition and versed in Scripture, carried her own understanding of faith, one that was both personal and reflective of the broader currents of religious change. Her beliefs, carefully expressed, added another layer to her presence, marking her as a woman of thought and principle. Her family, aware of the opportunities her position presented, worked to place her strategically. Every introduction, every engagement with influential figures, served to strengthen connections and open doors. Yet even as they acted, Anne's own character, formed through years of disciplined study and observation, allowed her to navigate these openings with subtlety. She could engage without overcommitting, charm without surrendering autonomy. In the midst of these days, whispers began to circulate of the king's interest in Anne, a mixture of admiration and political calculation. Henry VIII, ever conscious of appearances and alliances, recognized qualities in Anne that combined intelligence, beauty, and the potential to strengthen family influence. For Anne, the attention was both flattering and dangerous, a reminder that even careful composure could not shield her entirely from the currents of power that swirled around the throne. Every smile exchanged, every conversation overheard, carried weight. Courtiers observed, judges of character noted her responses, and the dynamics of favor began to take subtle shape. In a court defined by rapid shifts of loyalty, Anne's ability to remain measured and attentive provided her with protection and influence alike. And so, within the opulent halls and sunlit chambers of Henry VIII's court, Anne's education and refinement found their first real test. Here, amidst ambition, intrigue, and the constant interplay of power, she began to understand not only the grace and beauty of her surroundings but also the delicate balance required to survive and thrive in a world where influence could change with a single word, a single glance, or the favor of a monarch. Even as Anne navigated the shifting currents of Henry's court, the shadow of her family's ambitions loomed large. Her father and relatives understood that her presence in the royal household offered opportunities that extended beyond admiration. It was a chance to secure influence, forge alliances, and advance the Grey and Dudley fortunes. Every encounter, every display of poise, became part of a larger strategy carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. Yet, Anne herself remained mindful of the difference between her own inclinations and the expectations placed upon her. She valued learning, conversation, and the quiet confidence that came from knowledge. She had no desire for power or attention in its rawest form, but the world she inhabited rarely allowed for such choices. In court, appearances carried meaning, and the slightest hesitation could be interpreted as defiance or weakness. Her connection with the young King Edward VI, intelligent, reserved, and increasingly frail, began to take shape in these years. Their shared Protestant upbringing, combined with an understanding of scholarship and discipline, offered a subtle bond. They exchanged thoughts on literature, scripture, and philosophy, often in private corners of the court where observation was minimal. Through these quiet interactions, Anne's composure and intelligence became visible not only to the king but also to those who watched the edges of the royal household. Meanwhile, the Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, was consolidating his influence over the increasingly ill king. He watched the court and its rising figures with calculated attention, aware that the succession would soon become a question of life and death for families, fortunes, and faith. Dudley recognized in Anne not merely a noblewoman of refinement, but a potential instrument in the intricate game of politics that was about to reach its climax. Anne's family, particularly her father, understood the implications. Her return from France, the education she had received, and the favors she began to accrue were all seen as building blocks in the architecture of opportunity. Her marriage, long a matter of family negotiation, could become a bridge to greater influence, aligning her with men whose power could shape the kingdom's future. Yet even amidst these designs, Anne retained her own quiet strength. She observed, she measured, she spoke when necessary, and above all, she preserved her sense of self. The lessons of her years abroad, poise, language, discernment, allowed her to navigate not only the complex etiquette of the court but also the subtler, more dangerous currents of ambition and intrigue. As summer turned toward autumn in the year 1553, the political landscape shifted with alarming speed. King Edward's illness worsened, and the question of succession moved from speculation to urgent necessity. Those who controlled access to the king, who influenced his decisions, and who guided his advisers now held the levers of the nation's future. For Anne, the coming months would bring the full weight of these forces to bear. Her family's ambitions, the designs of powerful men, and the fragile health of the king combined to place her at the center of a drama she could scarcely have imagined in the quiet halls of Hever or the disciplined corridors of Margaret's court. And thus, without ceremony or warning, the stage was set for a moment that would change Anne's life forever, one in which the intersection of youth, education, lineage, and ambition would place her in the orbit of history itself. By mid-1553, the tension surrounding the succession had become impossible to ignore. King Edward VI's health, long precarious, was now in serious decline. Every whisper at court carried weight, every decision was scrutinized for its potential impact on the future of the realm. Those closest to the king maneuvered with urgency, aware that the death of the young monarch would unleash forces far larger than any single household or family. For Lady Jane Grey, the events unfolding were largely unseen. Her days remained filled with study, careful observation, and quiet routines. She continued to read, to write, and to practice the languages and disciplines that had defined her childhood. Yet the world she had inhabited, a world of tutors, family guidance, and continental refinement, was about to collide with the harsh realities of English politics. Her father, Henry Grey, and the Duke of Northumberland had long prepared for a moment such as this. The young king's demise would create a vacuum, and in that vacuum, they envisioned Jane as a figure who could serve both the Protestant cause and their own ambitions. To them, she was ideal, young, learned, devout, and crucially, malleable enough to serve the plans of others. The death of Edward VI on July 6, 1553, set the wheels in motion. 4 days passed in secrecy, as courtiers and advisers weighed the consequences of his passing and sought to secure their positions. During this time, Jane remained largely unaware of the magnitude of events swirling around her. Letters and rumors reached her, but the full gravity, that she was now being positioned as heir to the English throne, would only become clear in the days to follow. When the news was finally delivered, the reality struck with immediate force. Jane, barely 15, learned that she had been named successor, that her Protestant faith and noble lineage had rendered her the chosen alternative to Mary Tudor. The weight of expectation pressed down upon her, a burden she had neither sought nor desired. The announcement was accompanied by persuasion and insistence. Advisers, her own family, and allies of Northumberland explained that her duty was now to accept the crown, that her role was necessary to protect the realm's Protestant future, and that refusal was not an option. For Jane, the knowledge that her life would be forever altered collided with her sense of personal inclination. She did not wish to be queen, she did not seek power, she simply wished for study, reflection, and quiet. Yet resistance was dangerous. To refuse was to invite conflict with those who held both influence and ambition, whose plans were already in motion. Jane, aware of the delicacy of her position, consented, not with enthusiasm, but with the quiet understanding that her youth offered little choice. Duty, family pressure, and political necessity merged into a single force beyond her control. Within days, arrangements were made for her formal proclamation. The ceremonies that marked her elevation were careful, restrained, and steeped in protocol. Jane entered the Tower of London, the traditional place of royal residence before coronation, fully aware that the crown she now wore in name was not hers by desire, but by the designs of others. The Tower, a place of both majesty and menace, would become the backdrop for the next chapter of her life. Within its walls, she would navigate the complexities of court, the scrutiny of advisers, and the expectations of a nation that had yet to fully embrace her as its sovereign. In these early days as queen, Jane carried herself with the same composure and diligence that had defined her education and upbringing. She moved through the halls with quiet determination, aware that every gesture, every word, and every interaction could have consequences far beyond what she had ever imagined. Though she had entered the world of kings and queens reluctantly, it was here, amidst the shadows and stone of the Tower, surrounded by advisers, family, and history itself, that the brief, remarkable, and tragic story of Jane Grey's reign was about to unfold. Life in the Tower of London was a mixture of confinement and careful ceremony. Jane, though now recognized as queen, moved within walls that were both protective and isolating. The chambers were ornate yet austere, echoing with the footsteps of attendants, advisers, and the occasional messenger carrying news from the outside world. Every door, every corridor, was a reminder that her existence was now entwined with politics, expectation, and observation. Amid this heightened scrutiny, Jane found solace in writing. Her prayers, reflections, and letters became a private world where she could express thoughts unfiltered by courtly demands. Pages filled with Latin, Greek, French, and English held her study of scripture, philosophical inquiry, and personal reflection. Through this discipline, she preserved a sense of agency and clarity in a life increasingly dominated by others' designs. She wrote to her sisters, offering guidance and comfort, and to her father, urging caution and counsel. Her correspondence extended even to Mary, the very cousin whose claim had been set aside. In these letters, Jane's voice was calm, measured, and surprisingly mature. She expressed neither resentment nor fear in a way that diminished her intelligence or dignity. Instead, she sought to navigate a world where loyalty, faith, and duty were constantly tested. The Tower's gardens provided brief reprieves from confinement. Jane walked among trimmed hedges and flowering beds, the sounds of the city distant but ever present. She read aloud to herself, sometimes pacing as she memorized verses or composed letters. These hours of quiet reflection were essential to her sense of self, a small domain of order amid the storm of political expectation. Advisers continued to surround her, offering guidance on matters of state, succession, and protocol. They spoke in measured tones, emphasizing the weight of her Protestant faith and the responsibilities of her office. Though Jane understood the principles they outlined, she also recognized the precariousness of her position. Every decision she made, every gesture she offered, could be interpreted as loyalty, defiance, or naivety. In the midst of these days, she cultivated patience. The lessons of her childhood and education, observation, reflection, and restraint, proved invaluable. She learned to read intent behind words, to sense tension in otherwise polite exchanges, and to anticipate the consequences of small actions. Her composure became both a shield and a tool, allowing her to endure what might have overwhelmed others. Yet even as she carried herself with poise, Jane remained acutely aware of her youth. At 16, she was at the threshold of adolescence and adulthood, thrust into responsibilities far beyond her years. The crown she wore in name brought with it not triumph, but the silent burden of expectation, the hope of her family, the designs of powerful men, and the uncertainty of a nation still loyal to the memory of its rightful heir. In these quiet moments of writing and reflection, Jane exercised a form of agency that the Tower could not confine. Her prayers and letters bore witness to her inner life, her intelligence, and her moral resolve. Though history would see her only for her brief reign and tragic end, in these pages she remained fully herself, thoughtful, disciplined, and aware, a young woman navigating the intersection of innocence and power. And so, within the stone walls of the Tower, Jane Grey prepared not only for the ceremonies and duties of monarchy, but also for the challenges, choices, and trials that would test the strength of her mind, her faith, and her courage in the months to come. The beginning of 1554 brought unrest that threatened to engulf the nation. Rumors of discontent swirled through London, whispers of a rebellion led by Thomas Wyatt against Queen Mary's impending marriage to Philip of Spain. The city, already tense with the uncertainty following Edward VI's death, became a place where loyalty and suspicion mingled in every street and corridor. Within the Tower, Jane watched events unfold with a mixture of apprehension and quiet understanding. She had been a pawn in her family's ambitions, thrust into a position she neither sought nor desired, and yet the consequences of her existence extended far beyond her own life. Her father, Henry Grey, had joined Wyatt's rebellion, seeking to challenge Mary's claim and restore what they believed to be the Protestant inheritance. The news of her father's involvement arrived in fragments, carried by messengers and court gossip. Jane understood immediately the danger. Her position as a symbol of the Protestant succession made her a target. Though she herself had remained compliant, obedient, and cautious, her identity had been bound to the designs of others. The rebellion, however, was failing. Supporters were hesitant, armies faltered, and the momentum shifted toward Mary. In these days, Jane's life inside the Tower became even more constrained. Advisers and guards moved with purpose, the sounds of preparation and observation constant. She continued to write letters of counsel, encouragement, and reflection to her sisters, her friends, and even to Mary, whose claims she had been set aside to enforce. Her words were measured, showing both compassion and awareness of the broader stakes. Mary's forces advanced steadily, and with each day the inevitability of Jane's situation became clearer. She was no longer merely a figurehead. She had become a symbol in the minds of many, a representation of a contested faith and a disputed succession. The rebellion's failure meant that her survival depended entirely on the mercy and judgment of those who now held power. The weight of history pressed upon her young shoulders. 16, educated beyond her years yet still a child in the eyes of many, Jane faced the realization that her life was now inseparable from the turbulent politics of the kingdom. Her father's choices, the ambitions of Northumberland, the loyalty of courtiers, all converged to make her both fragile and dangerous in the eyes of those around her. Despite the tension, Jane maintained her composure. She continued to study, to write, to pray, and to reflect. Her intellect and faith were her anchors, guiding her through a period of uncertainty where every message, every movement, and every conversation could carry consequences of life or death. And as the rebellion crumbled, the inevitability became clear. Jane's fate was no longer determined by her own choices. The stage was set for a confrontation between mercy and politics, faith and power, innocence and ambition, a confrontation that would decide not only her life but also the legacy of her brief, extraordinary place in history. As February of 1554 approached, Jane faced a challenge unlike any she had encountered before. Queen Mary, fully aware of Jane's symbolic importance and the potential threat she represented, offered one last chance for survival. A Catholic priest, John Feckenham, was sent to her chambers, tasked with guiding Jane toward conversion, a simple declaration of allegiance to the Queen's faith that could spare her life. For Jane, the offer was fraught with moral complexity. She understood the consequences clearly. Compliance meant life, betrayal of her conscience, and the denial of the beliefs that had guided her study and reflection since childhood. To refuse was to accept the certainty of death, yet to remain steadfast was to preserve integrity and faith. Even at 16, she faced a decision that would define her entirely. The days that followed were marked by careful discussion, debate, and the patient persistence of Feckenham. He spoke with gentle authority, citing the traditions and teachings of the Church, reminding Jane of the mercy she could receive if she renounced her Protestant beliefs. Jane listened, considered, and responded with calm clarity, her words measured, her reasoning rooted in the scripture and humanist education that had shaped her from childhood. She refused to bend. "I base my faith upon the Word of God, not on the authority of the Church alone," she explained. Her voice, though quiet, carried the conviction of someone whose understanding of morality and justice had been forged through study, reflection, and personal discipline. Each day, she maintained composure, repeating her beliefs with a serenity that unsettled those around her. In private moments, Jane wrote and prayed. Her letters reflected her inner strength and her acceptance of what was to come. She counseled her sisters and friends, emphasizing the importance of remaining true to conscience and faith. The Tower, once a place of confinement, became a space where she exercised the freedom of thought and the quiet authority of conviction. Mary's court observed these exchanges with a mixture of concern and resignation. Jane's refusal made the Queen's decision more complicated. She had hoped for compliance, for a demonstration that mercy could be extended without compromising authority. Instead, Jane's steadfastness left no alternative but the final, irrevocable judgment. Even in the face of impending death, Jane's demeanor remained composed. Her intellect, her faith, and her understanding of the human heart gave her a dignity that transcended the walls of the tower. She faced the ultimate test, a moment in which innocence, conviction, and courage would meet the harsh realities of power and politics. And so, within the quiet chambers of the tower, Jane prepared herself. She knew that her choices were now complete, that her voice and her conscience had been exercised fully, and that whatever came next would be a testament to the young woman she had become, learned, steadfast, and unbroken by the ambitions and designs of those who had used her as a pawn in a game far larger than herself. The morning of February 12, 1554, dawned cold and grey over the Tower of London. A hush had settled across the city, broken only by the distant sounds of footsteps and the occasional call of a guard. Within the stone walls, Jane prepared herself with the quiet diligence that had marked her entire life. She rose early, her movements careful, measured, as though each gesture might somehow fortify her for what was to come. Through the window, she glimpsed the procession that carried her husband, Guildford Dudley, to the scaffold. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. The reality of the moment, once abstract in her prayers and reflections, was now immediate, undeniable. In the hour that followed, Jane readied herself for her own journey to the same fate. Clad in black, she carried her prayer book close to her heart. Her hands were steady, her mind focused on the words she had written the night before, prayers for courage, for mercy, for guidance, and for peace. Every step toward the scaffold was deliberate, every breath measured. The stone floors echoed softly beneath her, the air crisp, the sky a muted gray that mirrored the solemnity of the day. When she arrived at the platform, she paused, collecting herself. The crowd was silent, a sea of faces shadowed by anticipation and awe. Jane's voice, calm and composed, rose above the hush as she addressed those gathered. "I am a good Christian woman, and I die in the faith I have always held. Forgive me, as I forgive you all." Her hands moved with purpose. She allowed others to assist with the blindfold, yet she tied it with the care of someone accustomed to precision. The executioner offered guidance, and she adjusted herself, a subtle but final assertion of her own control in a moment dictated by the hands of others. The words she had carried in her heart, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," were spoken aloud. Her voice was steady, clear, and unflinching, echoing across the cold courtyard. Then, with a single, decisive motion, the axe fell, and her life was taken in an instant. It was over in a moment, yet the weight of the day lingered. Jane Grey, Queen for 9 days, scholar, daughter, and young woman of unwavering conviction, had met her fate with courage that belied her 16 years. She had faced the culmination of ambition, betrayal, and political intrigue without faltering in her beliefs, without surrendering the dignity that had defined her short life. The scaffold, silent now, bore witness to a life both brief and extraordinary. Those who had watched, some with sympathy, some with awe, understood that history had taken note. The girl who had preferred books to thrones, reflection to power, had left a mark far greater than her 9 days as queen could ever measure. In the quiet that followed, the city resumed its rhythm, but the memory of Jane Grey, her intellect, her courage, and her integrity, would endure, carried in letters, chronicles, and the whispers of those who remembered the young woman who had faced the ultimate trial with grace. After the scaffold emptied, the Tower of London fell into a quiet, somber rhythm. Jane's body, bound in chains, was carried with solemn care to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There, she would rest alongside other women who had met similar fates, and Bullen and Catherine Howard among them, their stories entwined by tragedy, politics, and the unforgiving demands of the crown. No grand monument marked her grave, no name engraved to announce her brief reign. Only the stone walls and whispered prayers bore witness to a life both extraordinary and painfully fleeting. At 16, Jane had traversed the heights of royalty and the depths of betrayal, only to be reduced to a shadow in history's vast chronicle. Yet even in death, her presence remained poignant. The prayer book she had carried to the scaffold, filled with reflections, letters, and verses, preserved the voice of a young woman whose intellect and faith had outshone the limitations imposed upon her. It spoke of conscience, courage, and the quiet dignity of a girl who had been thrust into a world she did not seek and had faced it with unwavering resolve. Her final words, written in careful script within its pages, reflected the clarity of her mind and the depth of her understanding. There is a time to be born and a time to die, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. In those words, Jane Grey captured the essence of a life measured not in days or titles, but in the courage to remain true to oneself amid forces beyond control. The Tower, silent now, held the echoes of her story, a story of ambition and innocence, of knowledge and constraint, of duty and choice. Jane had been a pawn in the ambitions of men, a symbol of political necessity, and yet she had never surrendered her inner life. Her letters, her prayers, and her composure ensured that, though her reign lasted only 9 days, her presence would endure far longer than any crown could confer. In the quiet shadows of the chapel, history remembered her not for the brevity of her rule, but for the integrity, intellect, and grace with which she met the end that had been imposed upon her. And in that remembrance, the girl who had longed only for books, study, and quiet reflection became timeless, a testament to courage, faith, and the indomitable spirit of a young woman who faced the world on her own terms, even when those terms were dictated by others.